Yeah, I wanted to talk about responding to the privatisation of higher education, really, partly because I think today and tomorrow there'll be lots of stuff about the privatisation of education, higher education, so I want to talk a little bit about how to respond to it, also because I think that's a pretty pressing matter now. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Sussex. Caroline mentioned what's been going on at Sussex. There's with the anti-outsourcing campaign and the response to it. So, and there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to talk about Sussex and draw out some more general implications. One is that there's a very determined top-down management at Sussex who are trying to marketise the university quickly and without too much dialogue, and in defiance of a lot of resistance. They're quite unusual. It's quite a specific case, but I think what they're doing is very directly and very quickly roughly what's going on in other places, more moderately and more slowly. So I think you can look at what's going on at Sussex and draw some lessons for other places. Also, if you want to talk about responding to the privatisation of higher education, then Sussex is quite a good place to look, because as well as having a strong management trying to push it through, there's been quite a strong opposition as well. And you can learn, I think I want to try and sort of draw out some lessons from what's happened with the opposition at Sussex. So it's a specific case, but I think there are some more general implications about privatisation of higher education and how to respond to it by looking at Sussex and generalising from that. And there are basically four main things I really wanted to draw out. One is about the balance between unions and the students being involved in responding to higher education, being more marketised. One is about more collective and individual approaches. One is about more media-oriented and more practical approaches. And another one is about sort of national and local disjunctures in people responding to higher education. Though there's sort of around those four themes there are various things which I would draw out from what's happened at Sussex and have a sort of national relevance. So really, what I think probably most people know roughly what's happened at Sussex. About a year ago, large-scale outsourcing, which Caroline mentioned, was announced. And for the first few months, the union's response was very much based around negotiating a good deal for workers who were going to be outsourced. There wasn't very much of a campaign about it in terms of the response. People tried to be patient with the unions, and after a few months, it became clear there wasn't going to be an oppositional type of campaign. So lots of members of staff and students got together and tried to organise such an oppositional sort of campaign to support the unions, not to antagonise them or be different from them. But the threat of the union, the response of the unions, not publicly but privately towards that campaign, was very negative, almost abusive in some cases. They saw the anti-outsourcing campaign as undermining the unions, dividing the workforce, threatening them. But the campaign was so successful, really, that the unions had to go along with it and be seen to support it. But nevertheless, they've carried on focus on negotiating a good deal for workers who are due to be outsourced. And to be fair to them, they've got some recent success in relation to pensions, although probably that success is partly to do with the weight of the campaign that's behind them. And then what happened basically in the spring was the anti-outsourcing campaign. I went to a lot of its early meetings, and it was quite a struggle at first. There weren't many people there. It didn't feel like there wasn't very much support. It was pretty depressing, to be honest. But they kept struggling on. After Christmas, it really took off. There was the occupation, which went on for 8 weeks. And then the pop-up union sprang up. The pop-up union is a sort of grassroots autonomous union, which is basically there to sort of energise and put pressure on the mainstream unions. It's quite clear it's there to support them. You can belong to both unions. I belong to the UCU and also the pop-up union. It's quite possible to do that. And this movement of the students in the occupation and the pop-up union, which is a staff union, pushed the conventional unions into a more oppositional approach. All the three unions on campus held indicative ballots, fairly reluctantly, but they'd been pushed into it. And the indicative ballots and surveys of students that have been held show quite widespread opposition at Sussex to outsourcing and quite big success for the support for the anti-outsourcing campaign. So round about 70, 80 or 90% yes votes in referendums, surveys and ballots against the outsourcing and in favour of the campaign, depending on exactly what the question was and which ballot it was. So there's been quite wide support at Sussex for this sort of thing. Nationally, basically, I said one of the things I wanted to talk about was the disjunction between the local and the national in responding to university marketisation. Nationally, the UCU has lots of policies and information about the dangers of higher education privatisation and how it needs to be resisted and how it needs to be stopped and so on. But when they've engaged locally with the branch, at Sussex at least, and in some other places, the focus is not at all oppositional towards university marketisation. It's been very much based around negotiating a good deal for workers. So there's been quite a big disjunction between what the national approach of UCU, which my union has been, and also what's happened in some cases locally. It's been quite a big difference. And I think you've also found, to go back a couple of years, that there was also a bit of a disjunction between the student movement and the union movement. I want to talk a little bit more about that. That's one of the things I think is quite important, is the different approach of students and unions, where when the current government came into power and the austerity policies were introduced and £9,000 fees were announced, the students were very gung-ho. You know, we had the big demonstration in London in, I think it was November 2010. The unions quite explicitly said that they'd been left behind by this. They organised a demonstration in March or something, you know, several months later. And they admitted that they'd been sort of outflanked by the students and sort of slightly ashamed by them. So there's been quite a disjuncture. And the students, I guess what I want to say really partly about the student and union thing is students have sort of led the way. They've led the way at Sussex. They pressurised the unions into doing things they didn't want to do. They pressurised the unions into being too oppositional. They led the way nationally in the UK a couple of years ago. They're leading the way in other countries, in Chile for a couple of years now or more than that. All sorts of things going on across the USA. So there's been a bit of a difference between the students and if you like, the collective organisations of staff at Sussex, but at other places too. And what about academics, academics like me? I think lots of us have been quite complicit in this whole process of university marketisation. We've been very much concerned about day-to-day issues about ourselves. Classic academic style, we're quite individualistic about the whole thing. We think about how these processes affect us individually. We're worried about our autonomy in the workplace. We don't pay too much attention to the poorest workers who are in our workforce, so the casualised workers. Universities are the third highest casualised sector in the UK after tourism and catering. Professors are very concerned about salaries. At Sussex, professors are enormously concerned about their own salaries, while these very low-paid workers are due to be outsourced. There are lots of passive supporters, from my experience of academics, who support the anti-outsourcing campaign at Sussex and similar things in other places, but are basically nominal supporters. And there have also been quite a lot of, I would call, sort of armchair Marxists who basically, in their academic work, are very critical, but actually proactively refuse to support the anti-outsourcing campaign for various sorts of ideological reasons. So they're not just passive, they're actually negative. And a lot of us as academics, the more liberal types amongst us, accept the procedures of going through university procedures to deal with these sorts of things. So we all have governing bodies at our universities. At Sussex we have Senate and Council. Lots of academics go through these procedures, but these governance structures at universities have been quite radically changed. At some universities have been quite radically changed in the last few years, so that academics have much less say than they used to do, and staff have much less say, and external members, who are often from the world of private business and management, have a much bigger say. So lots of us have been trying to have our say through structures in which we've become more and more marginalised rather than challenging those governance structures ourselves. And I was talking to somebody from the world of private business the other day and explaining the governance structures of UK universities, especially my one, and they were saying in private companies, the directors of private companies are more accountable than often university managers are. And to go back, that's a little bit about the academics and how we've been doing things. Our union, to go back to the union thing just for a second, because obviously those are organisations that, obviously not all of us, but lots of us belong to. Lots of these unions do a lot of good work on the ground around bullying and harassment, inequalities and redundancy, and all of these sorts of things. And it's very important and hidden work, which lots of people don't know about it. But lots of these issues, what you just mentioned, are going to be dramatically worsened with outsourcing, the increasing role of private providers in higher education and so on. And the unions seem less willing to engage with this overarching structural change which is going on. They deal with these issues, which I just mentioned, on a day-to-day basis and encounter them, as they come along, but are fairly unwilling in a coordinated national sort of way to try and respond in a determined and effective fashion against increasing marketisation and privatisation of universities, which will make all those issues much, much worse. They just sort of deal with those issues as they go along. So I think nationally, unions need to be much more robust about tackling this sort of overarching structural change. And there obviously have been some things, some national campaigning type things going on. So the campaign for the public university has been around for quite a long time before lots of people in this room, probably including me, were thinking about public education as being under threat. And also we've had the Council for the Defence of British Universities, which has just come along recently. But both of these, which are good, I'm not criticising them, are largely information and lobbying organisations. They're not especially organisations of collective action. And I said one of the things I wanted to talk about was the tension between a sort of media and ideas approach and a practical approach. Lots of the stuff that's gone on around the marketisation of education has been about talking and debate. So it's sort of what we're doing today and what we're doing tomorrow. But we've been doing this for quite a long time now, talking about the marketisation of higher education and treating that as if it's a type of resistance, which of course is an important type of resistance. But there's more to it than that. I think one of the things we need to do is to talk to each other a bit less often and talk to people outside ourselves a bit more often. So there was an interesting organisation that Bob and I were both involved in at the beginning, and I wasn't involved for very long, but maybe you were for a bit long, which was about protecting the university. It was based in Brighton, and that was based around going out to schools and talking to parents and pupils about what was happening in universities, so that it wasn't just a bunch of the converted talking to each other. So I think we need to talk and debate, but we need to talk outwards a bit more than we used to do. But also in having this media informational approach, one of the really striking things about what's happened at Sussex is the occupation was staggeringly brilliant at this. They were amazing at using social media. They hit all the national news media. If you ever heard any of the occupiers debating with the management, I'm biased, but I think even if you weren't biased, the occupiers were much more articulate and informed than the management were. It was a propaganda, it's been a massive propaganda success. But what's happened, in terms of the outsourcing, I hate to be bleak about this, but almost nothing has happened at us in terms of the outsourcing. The management are driving ahead with it anyway. So there's a big limitation about basing. This is partly why I brought up the campaigns, the two campaigns, Public University and Council for the Defence of British Universities. There's a big limitation in talking to ourselves, but also basing our campaign around ideas, propaganda, the message, because it's having a sort of limited effect at places like Sussex. And it's also very much engaging with management and of universities and with government. Certainly as far as Sussex goes and Cameron goes, the management and the government seem to be fairly unbudgeable by campaigning, by talking and debate and ideas. One of the things which at Sussex has happened has been interesting very recently. The campaign has started to target the private companies who they think are going to bid for the outsourcing contracts like Sodexo. So I think also in terms of if there's going to be a less ideas-based approach and a more practical approach, I think it needs to be maybe engaged at slightly different targets. So I won't say much more, but I just wanted to say two or three more things very briefly about what the alternatives are, and actually one of them I can be really quick on because Caroline already mentioned this, which is one alternative is the free university system, so like the Social Sciences Centre at Lincoln that she mentioned, Free University in Brighton that she mentioned. I visited an occupation a couple of years ago in London and gave a talk about the privatisation of universities, and at the end of the talk somebody said, let's set up a free university. We were in an occupation, so we went and found a room. Somebody offered to put on a course the next day. We put it up on the Facebook group. The Free University was running. It was running courses the next day, and it's still running, amazingly. It doesn't really have a steady location anymore because that occupation has now gone. It's moved on to be occupied another place, and now it's dispersed. But that Free University still exists. And the Free University is an alternative to the public university and to the sort of more marketised and privatised university. But actually, I think what's really important is to protect the public university. The Free University as an alternative is really important, but we should be having a sort of more oppositional approach to the marketisation of the public university. And a Charter of Higher Education is a really good thing, and I'm really glad we're looking at that today and tomorrow, but I think the really important thing is what we do with the Charter of Higher Education, how we implement it, how we make sure it's carried through. I think academics need to take a more active oppositional role. They need to support the students. Like I said, at Sussex, the unions were fairly negative about students privately at first. Unfortunately, it seems to me we need to appeal to the self-interest of academics to mobilise them. At Sussex, the thing that mobilised academics the most in terms of them lobbying and campaigning is when a couple of groups of academics were told they would have to be moved buildings and weren't consulted about it. This mobilised academics much more in some cases than the outsourcing did, than the redundancies of 115 workers two or 3 years ago. You have to appeal, sadly, you have to seem to appeal to the self-interest of academics to get them to do things. And as I said, I think we need to be, if we're going to be ideological, we need to talk to other people apart from ourselves, but we need to also be sort of disruptive in a sort of practical way. And in terms of being disruptive in a practical way, I think the old union approach that my union anyway takes quite often of having one-day strikes now and then is not the way to do it, because it's an expensive way to have a demonstration effectively. It's demonstrative action, you lose a day's pay and everything goes back to normal the next day. So I think in terms of having more practical sort of action, more imaginative approaches need to be taken. There's a risk to this, I'll nearly finish now, which is that, and the risk to this is why I think it has to be collective, and we've seen the risk to this sort of approach at places like London Met, where Max Watson from Unison and Steve Jeffries, who were activists in the anti-privatisation campaign there, were victimised and put into disciplinary processes under a spurious reason which had nothing to do with their actual activity, but it was fairly clear it was connected to their anti-outsourcing activity. The student protesters at Millbank got massively punitive sentences for what they did. The Sussex occupiers have been treated with a very heavy hand. There's been no attempt to have any meaningful dialogue with them. The response has been heavy-handed policing and attempt to prosecute staff and in some cases discipline students. So there's a risk to this to individuals, which is why I think the approach needs to be collective, and that's partly what I meant earlier on when I said there's a sort of collective and individual thing. So to conclude, I guess, I was trying to talk about the balance between unions and students and the collective and individual approach and the media and more practical approach and the national and local disjuncture in unions. I think there needs to be a more practical and disruptive approach and not just a media ideas-oriented approach, a fairly collective response rather than the sort of individual response which academics tend to take. I think academics need to be less complicit or passive in the whole process, which lots of us are, including myself to a large extent. I'm guilty of this. We need to be a bit more oppositional. And when you look at those three things together, being disruptive, being collective, and being oppositional, I really think you have to look at trade unions. Those are the organisations which are in a position to do those, to do those sorts of things, and those are the organisations at the moment which have a very mixed record at national level and across different localities in trying to respond to these sorts of issues. So, yeah, that's it.